Welcome to Rehash.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. This is our final episode of season 4. I'm so excited today to be speaking with Feems, a DAO governance contributor and creative media producer, all about global internet culture, developing a global Web3 workforce, and what it's like contributing to multiple DAOs. Feems is the creator of Work on Chain and the Web3 Professionals podcast, and a contributor to Bankless DAO, Interest Protocol, and Butter. Feems was nominated by Tim Black and voted onto the podcast by Tim Black, Aaron Soskin, David Phelps, Dina Burke, and Govern. Before we dive into our conversation, here's a quick word from the Web3 projects that helped make this season possible.
Social media wasn't designed for ads and algorithms. It was made for people. And at Lens Protocol, we're putting people back in control. We're not looking for users' data. We're here to build a community of collaborators, builders, artists, and dreamers ready to unlock a new world of social media. This isn't just an app. It's a flourishing ecosystem of platforms and experiences owned and operated by the developers and creators who are bringing it to life. In the Lensverse, you don't just own your content, you own everything. Your data, your connections, the value you bring to the table, it all stays in your possession, exactly where it should be. As a creator, the Lens ecosystem offers a new set of tools for connecting with your audience. Your data is truly portable and belongs to you. Post once and distribute everywhere in the Lensverse. You can even take your followers with you from app to app. As a developer, you can skip right past building the base layers and scaling your users by plugging your new app directly into Lens's existing infrastructure and community. So whether you create with a brush or a camera, sound waves or lines of code, it's time you got your due. Come create the future of social media with us on Lens Protocol. Lens is the last social media handle you'll ever need.
Have you seen how epic Ambire Wallet is?
How epic it is?
Yeah, cue the music. Ambire is a Web3 wallet that makes crypto self-custody easy and secure for everyone. Instead of relying on clunky seed phrases, you can create an account with the hardware wallet or username and password, secure it with two-factor authentication, and regain access with Ambire's cloud recovery. Need to pay out some contributors or execute a bunch of trades? No problem, Chief. Queue up as many transactions as you want, and when you're ready, execute the entire batch at the same time, paying gas only once. You can even prepay for gas with stablecoins or Ambire's native wallet token, which will get you some cash back. Without ever leaving the Ambire interface, you can manage assets from over a dozen chains, safely migrate them with Ambire's built-in bridge, and seamlessly interact with dApps like Uniswap, Aave, and Snapshot, all within the same transaction. Plus, Ambire is constantly growing their dApp catalog with trusted partners and collaborating with builders who want to establish the new standard for smart contract wallets. So, pretty epic, huh?
Yeah, I already know all that though. I've had an Ambire wallet for months.
And you didn't tell me?
You never asked. To get involved and truly own your assets, go to ambire.com. How was your day?
Bad.
What happened?
I bought some NFTs and then they just disappeared.
Sounds like your NFT creator should have used NFT.storage.
NFT. What?
NFT.storage. Come on, I'll show you. With NFT.storage, anyone can easily upload their NFT data to a decentralized and reliable storage network, completely for free.
Wow! How does it work?
Well, instead of relying on centralized and impermanent storage solutions, NFT.storage uploads your files to IPFS and Filecoin. These are powerful peer-to-peer networks that are made for the decentralized web. Thanks to IPFS's unique storage system, you can be confident that once your files are uploaded, they'll be accessible from anywhere in the world for as long as you'd like. They're already trusted by some of the biggest names in Web3, like OpenSea, Magic Eden, and Rarible. By adding files to these networks for free, NFT.storage is helping to turn proper NFT data management into a public good. This will ensure that NFTs will remain accessible and secure in the long run, so you won't get rugged again.
Gee, so I just upload my files and NFT.storage will take care of the rest?
Now you're getting it! Go to NFT.storage today to upload some NFT data of your own, for free. And be sure to follow NFT.storage on Twitter, @NFTDOTStorage.
So, without further ado, here is our guest, Feems. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited, actually, to have this chat.
I'm really excited as well. The topics that you have really dedicated your time to in the Web3 space are topics that I'm very passionate about as well. So I'm really excited to get your take on all of these things. Something that I think a good starting point is to start with a little conversation about global internet culture and what that means to you before we even dive into all the Web3 stuff. So when we think about global internet culture, when we think about culture in general, typically we think each culture or each country or each region around the world has its own distinct culture. So how is it that once we move online, we're able to come together and find this global culture that sort of surpasses these geographic and language boundaries that we're traditionally used to?
Yeah, I think that only in the last couple of years have we really amalgamated this like global internet culture. And so like that's to say like in the, early days of when I was exploring like forums and communities and things like that, things that like bound us together on a global audience were kind of the topics at hand. And so I was part of like an electronic music community or drum and bass community. And those, although had localization kind of, communities, we were all tied by the music, but the music was also like represented by specific regions, right? So for drum and bass, for example, it was like the London sound, or if it was techno, then it was Detroit. And so we still had our regional kind of placements in regards to that. And I also think that in terms of like fashion too, like I was really into fashion. And when I went into Japan and like you go to the Harajuku district, and that was also very regional. And then you had these like social media came, right? And so with social media came with like Pinterest, right? And so the Pinterest look, became kind of global, whether it's like chuggy, as they would say, or edgy. And so like people actually started to see like what others were dressing like. And then I think that like around the 2010s, 2012s is like when things started to amalgamate a little bit more. But I think that the push really of like a oneness of internet culture or a globalization that got like outside of regional borders was really propelled by things like Instagram, was really propelled by things like Netflix when they introduced international programming. I mean, for example, is that I've always really been interested in creative media and arts and film that weren't necessarily in English, but they just so happened not to be necessarily in English. And like when I would share this with my friends or roommates would see me like watch TV shows with subtitles, they'd be like, why are you watching that? Like, who are you trying to be? Whereas like, I think with the growth of the international programming with Netflix, watching TV shows with subtitles just became the norm. And so I think that like, and as well as with TikTok, right? And so I think that now we are at the stage where we can have kind of a global culture that appears to be borderless, but it is still like rooted in specific regions, right? Like specific regions still drive trends and cultures and the way that we behave. And that my kind of hope for, I guess, the future of the internet, which I see as like Web3 is, if we would want to call it right now, is something where we can create more of a global internet culture. And what that looks like, I'm just really excited to see.
Totally. I love the examples you gave around like coming around common interests such as music or even, watching movies with subtitles. And I think what you said about kind of like this local culture still existing, but then being able to experience that at a global scale. Like, for example, BTS, the boy band from Korea that's become huge all over the world. A lot of their songs are still in Korean and, a lot of people don't even understand what they're saying, but they still like to go to their concerts and like to listen to their music. And even things like anime, which has been around for a really long time, like a lot of anime movies or shows, or manga, like all of these things are not in English, but has reached a Western audience, an English speaking audience for a really long time. So I love those examples. If you were to kind of summarize, taking these examples and summarize a few of the main characteristics that global internet culture has, how would you kind of like categorize those main features?
Yeah, I mean, like it's not going to be necessarily unique, but I think that algorithms, for example, and people understanding like trends have really kind of surpassed internet culture and kind of shaped the way that people behave on the internet. I think that the positiveness of internet culture is that it allows now people to kind of not adopt, but also kind of incorporate specific kind of trends or colors or musics or sounds into like their lives. And so I think that in regards to internet culture, it's like two sides, right? So there's ones for like the creatives that just want to collaborate with people internationally and just like really love their sounds. Another example of outside of K-pop, I love K-R&B, right? And so Korean R&B. And so it's the similar sounds of like R&B music, but then also just happens to be in Hangul, like in Korean. And so I think that we're seeing more of that amalgamation. Same thing with like the growth of like Spanish speaking artists, right? Like Bad Bunny or Rosalia and things like that. And people being able to kind of, connect with those individuals, I think is like what really propels internet culture. I think that it's going to be like a community who kind of, is driven by the love of memes, or it could be like people who kind of just connect with other individuals that so happen to be across the pond.
When you look at things like memes or even trends on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, do you see these as being truly sort of like an artifact of global internet culture, or do you still see these things being limited by local culture a little bit? Like, is there a meme that maybe, people in the Western world who have maybe seen a movie or know a reference would understand, or a TikTok trend that would only make sense to people who have experienced a certain local culture, and maybe like people from the opposite side of the world might not understand quite as well?
Yeah. So the funny thing is with TikTok, and I only know this because like my cousins at 8 years old told me about it. It wasn't TikTok. It was called Musically. And so actually the app is like where people would kind of sing over songs and like do these like really weird, like fast movements with their hands. And I think the thing is like with internet culture, yes, it could be driven by maybe particular regions, but I think that the normalcy or the behaviors within that is just more of like a network effect, right? And so as you notice with TikTok, the dances aren't necessarily just like American based dances, right? Like dances come from all over, sounds come from all over. Some like popular sounds are not even in English or like kind of follow the kind of English song format. And so I think that with like internet culture is really access to information. And then it's the individual who will then create that and then be able to distribute it to a wide audience who will then either connect with it and like also do those dances. And I think that that's the difference between maybe like then and now is that many of us have access to internet. Many of us have like high speed internet and also access to like mobile phones. And so we're also able to distribute that type of content like immediately to anybody all over the world. Whereas like previously, all of like creative media or arts or films, like or memes, for example, were really determined by a regional basis based on your like network connection or based by your distributor or like, the film distributions or things like that. I think that now, because the distribution is so diverse, it allows us really to develop or understand a global culture, but rather than like erase particular cultures, it's just more providing us with an opportunity to have a global lens and a global perspective, which also limits othering from one another, which I hope like that's why I love the internet. Is that like I don't look at people as like, oh, you come from there, you're so different from me. Like I can like actually see where you come from because like I can go on YouTube, for example, and see that.
Right. Yeah. You're not limited to just the geographic location you live in. Like if you live in a big city like New York City, no problem there. You're going to see people from all over the world in your day-to-day life. But if you're from a small town and maybe don't have the privilege of having that exposure, you can easily go on TikTok or YouTube or just go online and still get to experience these different cultures. So absolutely. So moving now more into Web3, into the space that we're all in, how have you seen Web3 either contribute to or take away from this global internet culture that we've helped built up over the last several years?
Yeah, I think that So the funny thing is how you're talking about like a small town is that like I left a really big town to live in a small town. And the way that I, found Web3 was through internet friends. But the way that I stayed and I felt less lonely was like working in Web3 in a small town. So like I was able to really connect with people who were from like bigger cities or maybe like other cities that I've been in on a cultural level. I think that like, Web3 is kind of interesting is that I kind of got into Web3 as like a way of kind of dismantling older systems. So like, in all honesty, like I used to work in nonprofits and, I just wanted to make an impact in my community. And I realized that that is pretty limiting if you don't have like access to funds or capital or network, or people really understanding your cause, especially if you live in a smaller community. And like, I kind of saw Web3, particularly like the blockchain, as a way to kind of dismantle the nonprofit industrial complex. Like I figured it was a way of like internet creators to come together to make a change for ourselves. So there was like a sovereignty kind of aspect of it. And I think that currently when I think about Web3, like I think about like blockchain and the future of the internet. But I also think that we haven't really been doing a good job at defining things because I think what I think of Web3 is very different from other people, what they think of Web3. What I think of DAOs is very different than other people, what they think about DAOs as well. And so it's not that like, how is it not aligned with the internet culture? With the particular internet cultures, it's defined, right? So like when I'm going into a forum and it's a music forum, I already know what I'm going to get. When I go into a DAO, I don't know what I'm going to get necessarily, right? And I think that we have a lot, like I think we're still figuring it out, but I don't think that we're so early that we can't really describe why we're there and what we're doing and like what the purpose of this is, but also, going back to the technology as to like, what is the point of the blockchain? Like, why do we use the blockchain? Like, what is the value of crypto really? Right. And like, and how do we support innovation and how do we also support like sovereignty? And that's not to say like capital sovereignty where you like have your own access to your own funds, but also like, how do we create communities in which like people can also be go-getters and like also can work collaboratively, but independently and come as independence as well. I think that we have this, narrative of symbiotic, connected coordination sort of, like narrative that like is like that we need it. But the thing is that we're not doing it very well. And so like, I'm all about like breaking up everything and seeing like what works and what doesn't work and like starting afresh. And I think that what I hope, especially in the bear, because like really there's nothing to lose, is that we really take the time to really experiment things. I think as individuals, we really take the time to think about why we're doing the things and then like how we can make it better, not only for like everybody, but also for ourselves. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to ask a follow up to that. When you talk about experimenting during the bear, which I could not agree with more, this is the most low stakes time to experiment. So really go out there and do your thing. But when we experiment from the perspective of trying to better the space, trying to better the experience that people have when they enter into a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, and maybe improving their overall experience, but, just helping them to understand what to expect when they enter a community like that, how to contribute, how to participate, how to be a meaningful community member. What are some ways that you think we should be experimenting with that in order to further get us towards this goal of, creating this global culture around Web3 and around these Web3 communities?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of DAOs, it's more of an experimentation because I think that we've been really loose when it comes to onboarding. I also think that we haven't been prioritizing onboarding. And so like, what does onboarding necessarily look like? With DAOs, yes, they are decentralized, but it doesn't necessarily mean that DAOs don't have a purpose or an objective or how those objectives are actually tied to the activity that everybody's doing. I think that when people come in to DAOs or any internet community, right, they're looking at coming into a community. And I think the difference within like regular like music communities where like music is the thing that tied us is that these DAOs also have a very large treasury, right? So capital is involved. And then human capital is involved, which is also a currency as well. And so I think that as a community, like any DAO really has to like reflect, I think. And I think it'd be really great on a seasonal perspective to kind of understand like, why are we here? What are we doing? And how are we going to get there together? And I think as an individual, I always have this rule. It's like you're either earning or you're learning, right? So if you are in a DAO and you are not enjoying yourself and you're not gaining anything in terms of like educational knowledge or like experience as an individual, or also just feeling like your contributions are not of value, it's the internet. You could leave the Discord, it's not your job. And so I think that that's also what kind of pushes me into this like project of work on chain, is that like, I would like to just provide information for freelancers. That's what we are, right? And, or professionals who want a little bit of sovereignty on how they work and who they work with. And I understand that those things aren't really necessarily taught, but a lot of us are adults, and that's just kind of like the deck that the life has handed you, is that you yourself as an individual have to decide whether or not you spending time in this organization or with these people is actually valuable. And if it's not, there's just so many other types of organizations or digital projects or things like that you can participate in. But I think that like from an organizational standpoint, yes, there is responsibility, but like we can't change everybody. I think it's up to the individual really to decide whether or not that community is right for them. And if it is, then collaboratively working with other people to create systems in place so that people could be properly onboarded and feel welcome, but also bring and add value. And I think that that's the thing that's not talked about in DAOs, is that like, you have to bring something if you want to get something from anything. And that's just how it is. Right. And I think we're recognizing that in the bear, because there's a lot of people who have left this space. Right. And it's really about like understanding what drives people, like what are their incentives and like what are their goals. And if their goals, incentives and values align, then maybe we can, work together, and maybe then we can like respect one another, and maybe then we can be effective in this coordination experiment, which everybody calls.
Yep. A couple of terms I've heard you talk about a lot are internationalization and localization. Can you explain to listeners what these two terms mean, and then how you see these being applied either well or being applied not well in the Web3 space, to Web3 projects, to Web3 communities, to everything that we're kind of doing here?
Yeah. And so internationalization, what I mean by that is actually just content in different languages. So not necessarily content that is translated from English, but also content that is within their original like language. So original content in the original language. And then what I mean by like localization, and so let me go back. An example then of that would be like Bankless DAO. So Bankless DAO also has sub DAOs or nodes that are representative of different regions that primarily speak like one type of language. And so, for example, we have Bankless China that mostly speaks Mandarin, Bankless Japan, Bankless Korea, and so forth and so forth. There are also other groups as well that are specifically for like, the Latin American region that will speak specifically in Spanish, or there are German DAOs or whatever and so forth. And so like, that's what I mean by internationalization. So like internationalizing organizations globally, primarily those that speak in their native language. And then what I mean by like localization is that localization doesn't necessarily mean by like regions, but it could also just mean city meetups. And so I know that like FWB also has like city meetups as well, or like, I don't know, city groups. I'm probably butchering that, but like, that's what I mean necessarily, is that like in the forum, the electronic music forum that I was in, like I was in the Toronto channel. And so like what that meant is that like, yes, we were tied by the music that we loved, but then we could also go to like parties together and events together and do like meetups together within our city. And, and Boys Club also has that. And there are other groups that also have that as well. It's just an opportunity for people not only to meet in their local environment, but like what I hope and like what I don't see much of necessarily is like for each kind of city node to kind of create content around like what's important to them. And I guess like an example for that would be like ATX DAO. So like the Austin DAO. And so like what I'm hoping is that there's more of that, because I would rather like micro DAOs or like local nodes than like huge scale global kind of DAOs, because like I don't think that like then we'll just create like a uniculture, and the uniculture so far I've seen has just really been kind of driven by like American perspectives and, you know, and things like that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like how those two are connected, the localization and the internationalization, because sometimes I think we can see these things as being opposites or being on opposite sides of the spectrum, but they really work really well hand in hand, because you need both pieces to really build like a solid community that people feel comfortable in. Like today, our lives are very much a mix of IRL and URL. And I think we need an equal amount of, you know, this feeling of connectedness and community in both of those communities to feel, you know, happy as like a whole person. So I really like how you talk about the connection of those. Going back to sort of talking about DAOs and how do we bring meaningful contribution to DAOs, I think that is a really big question, and maybe the toughest thing for people who are just getting into Web3 and getting into experiencing DAOs for the first time is knowing how to contribute. So when you think about this like Web3 workforce, you know, it's on the one hand, it's like there's so many resources to learn online, from YouTube, from these MOOCs, from all different places, even TikTok to a certain extent. But the Web3 workforce somehow still looks very similar to the Web2 tech workforce. We were just having a conversation about this before we started recording the podcast. So I guess like from your perspective, why is it that that's happening, and how can we encourage people to take advantage of all the learning opportunities online so that we can start to foster a more diverse and a more global workforce in Web3?
Yeah. So I'm just going to answer the second one to answer the first one. I think that we actually just need more content that speaks to regular audiences, but made by people who understand regular audiences. I think that a lot of the content that we have, not including yours, but a lot of the content that we have when it comes to understanding like Web3 or DAOs or DeFi are made by really, really smart people that like, you know, that speak in really, really big words in ways that are very, very academic. And, you know, and like, and we understand that majority of people like to watch like TikToks and, you know, short reels and like things that are engaging and entertaining and using plain speak. And so what I mean by plain speak is that I actually had to learn the skill, is that, you know, after university, like I obviously want to write like as smart as I want to, but when I was working in communications, that wasn't actually connecting with regular audiences. I had to like deconstruct policy. And so there was a rule in which we had to write in like plain speak. So much so that like an 8-year-old would need to understand what's going on. And I think that that's the thing, is that I think that like when people are trying to get into Web3, there's no clear path of like where they fit in, because the content that we have is just so like amalgamated, so mixed together. And so it doesn't actually say like, if you're like a designer, this is your pathway. Or if you are a creator, this is your pathway. Like we use words like ownership and collectivism and coordination and decentralization. And like, that's great. And like, that's super exciting. But like, if you want regular people to participate as a workforce, right, as an industry, then we have to provide pathways for doing so. And Web2 had done that too, right? And so like they had a bunch of devs, and then, you know, they introduced like digital marketing. And so like that was a way, and then there were like digital marketing schools and content and things like that. And then there was like content designing, which is basically like copywriting for digital, which I did a lot too. And so they're like, so I think that like why like Web3 can learn from Web2 in terms of its educational onboarding and like how it kind of sprung out to different types of, you know, roles and professions. And then how those professions also like broke out into those on like education and content and things like that, so that we can find a place for all those people. I think that where we're not as an advantage as of yet is that all of those people are not interested in working in the spaces yet, right? So like the UX designers, the content designers, the product designers, the DEI specialists, because like primarily from my experience, a lot of focus and priority has been on development. A lot of funding has been on development and less so on strategic onboarding and like less so on like planning and product. And, the reason why a lot of Web3 in terms of working seems like Web2 is that a lot of people from Web2 has moved to Web3, right? And so without us just like taking a pause to being like, how is our like actual culture going to be different? However, I think that the differences between Web 2 and Web 3 on a cultural aspect is the building in public, which like never would happen in Web 2. The fact that like I could just like message a stranger whose project I'm really interested in and say like, hey, I'm really interested in your project. Like, would you be willing to like have a chat with me? Or like, are you open to collaboration? I think that the open collaboration thing or just the opening to conversations, would be like, doesn't exist in Web 2. And I've had like people like send me messages like, early on when I was like in DAOs, just being like, hey, like, I don't really know about DAOs. Like, are you able to onboard me? And this is to say like now, please don't DM me to ask me that question. There's tons of information in regards to that. But I think that like, so it's not like all is lost. I just think that right now we just really have to go back to like the why. And if we want to onboard people, we need to be really strategic about the types of professions. Like I'm using the container professions because I don't want to like, silo people. We want to onboard. And then from there, can we really develop the effective onboarding tools or effective education or like, projects that matter to people or products that people want to buy today?
Yeah. And I think that all ties back into the like internationalization concept you were talking about earlier too, because to me, like internationalization isn't just about like language. It's everything that comes as a result of language. So it's building products that can benefit people who not just speak other languages, but that come from different parts of the world, that come from different cultures, that come from different needs. And I think that's what we're really struggling with in Web3 is that we have kind of what it seems like to me developed another version of V2 of Silicon Valley is what it looks like to me. And we're still seeing all of the VC money and resources going to companies formed in the Western world and not to developing and emerging regions around the world. And we had an episode with Cami Ramos where she talked a lot about this and how we need to be, in order for crypto to survive. I mean, she has this really strong thesis that in order for crypto to survive, we need to start putting our money and our resources into emerging regions like Latin America, for example, where she's from. And it's a really compelling thesis and people should go back and listen to that episode too. But all this to say, yeah, I think this internationalization thing is like super broad and really permeates into every aspect of what we're doing in Web3. And then I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned, that we need to be creating better content than what we have been. What does that better content look like to you? Because I've heard you say, that like you take a very strong approach to creating content that is interesting, that's engaging, that's straightforward, that actually help people to understand how they can participate more effectively and sustainably in the space. What does that actually look like in practice? What kind of content do you think people should be creating, or how should people be thinking strategically about the content they create?
Yeah. So not better, just different. Because I would not as
different. Yep.
So I will answer that question. I just want to go back to the thing with Cami and the same thing with the narrative is that like, it's not only about investing in emerging markets. It's also kind of dispelling the narrative that specific regions need to save these emerging markets, right? It's investing in talent and paying them a fair wage of what you would pay in the Western Hemisphere. It's investing in founders. It's investing in hackathons within those particular regions so that we can have much more international projects and products. It's the inflows of capital to invest in talent that deserves to build, right, within this global ecosystem. And in terms of content, so it's like I said, it's not about better content. It's creating content for like audiences that will engage with your particular content. And so the way that I look at content, whether it was, the governance education system, which like, we've come to an end in regards to that. And the same thing with like Web3 Pro or work on chain is that I strategically had to be like, who is my audience? Who am I trying to talk to? And what is it that I'm trying to achieve? And I think that that's the thing is like where I said before is that if we are trying to onboard individuals, professionals, builders, or whatever, we have to know how we need to talk to them, like what matters most to them, and how do we get them there to do the activities that we want them to do. And so in my case, like I would like to onboard much more highly scaled freelancers, like non-technical or technical freelancers, but that are not developers, like UX and products and communication and branding and so forth, social media strategy. And so it's like, okay, great. How do I connect with them? All right, I use social media. In what format do they usually consume content? Like this. What kind of content are they most interested in? This way. How do they want, like, what are they most curious about in Web3? This is what they're most curious. And so that's what you think about. It's like education, right? Like, why do people go to school? To learn. And so it's like, all right, what are they going to do with that learning tool? And so that, I think that that's the thing that we need to kind of think about is that like, it's great that, we are preaching to the choir, but we're all in the church. You know what I mean? It's like, if we really want to onboard people and allow diversification and internationalization, we just have to like understand what type of content people want to consume and like produce that if you want to, if like that's what you're interested in producing content. If you're not, like there are talented individuals like ourselves that, protocols can hire to do that for them. But what I'm saying is that it's not a one size fits all. And I think that what I've been seeing with products in Web3 and communication in Web3 and so forth is this one size fits all, approach to things, approach to building things like, oh, that person's building that. Maybe I should also build that same kind of theme or concept. Like what I hope in the bear is that we see much more innovation and much more experimentation that is not tied to capital. Like, let's just try to do things for the sake of doing things to see whether or not it could work.
Yeah, you should talk to LDF because that is literally like her sermon to everybody every day. But also I wanted to go back when you say, we're building products and communities in Web3 that's one size fits all. By all, we just mean all the people that are currently in Web3, which is, a very kind of homogenous group of people, the same group of people we saw emerge from the Web 2 tech world. So I think another interesting thing too is like the way you lay that out, like create content for your audience, build products for the people that you're trying to build products for. It sounds so obvious and straightforward, but it does need to be said because when you look around, it does kind of seem like the content we're creating in this space and the products we're building in this space are content and products that we're building for ourselves and our friends and not necessarily for the audience that we're trying to reach out to. So, I see people building onboarding products in Web3 that are so technical and challenging to use. And I'm like, what aspect of this is good for a new person that you're trying to onboard into this space? And I think it's just at the end of the day, they're building products for themselves and for their friends who already know what they're doing in the space and are not their target audience. So as kind of obvious and straightforward as it sounds to create content for the audience you're trying to reach out to, build products for the people that you're trying to, help. I think it does warrant actually saying that out in words because we're not doing it.
I also think that a lot of people should, and this was the thing too, when I entered Web3, so like full transparency, my background is actually in like information architecture, digital strategy, communications, and governance. And so for a while I was like, and creative media. And so for a while I was like, no, like I want to try new things in Web3. And so I did them and that was fun. But then I was like, all right, if I want to sustain myself and have an impact, I need to lean on what I know. And I think the thing is that a lot of people like specific components of what they're building at and they're really good at that, but then they might not be great or understand, like, due to lack of experience, like actually how to onboard people because they've never actually onboard people. So how can you build a tool to onboard people if you never onboarded people? How do you create a social impact project if you've never volunteered? Like, and so I think the thing is that we discount life experience. And we really need to, and not to say that we need to stop somebody from doing anything because they haven't had that life experience, but we also need to value life experience. Like I've heard so many times, like as I was in the space, like building that, like, hey, but you haven't been here since 2017. And I'm like, what does that matter? Like I'm trying my best. I'm leveraging on my years of experience in this area to do this thing. And like, I've been proven right. Like I'm able to do this. I'm able to connect. I'm able to understand people. And I think that now I'm at a stage where I'm no longer scared to try the things, but also say like, I don't know the things. And so I think that like what's interesting in the bear, speaking about like just experimenting, is that like, I'm ready to just really experiment in the space. And that also means like experiment with different chains and experiment with different projects and just really listen to myself just so that I can get a better understanding of this like blockchain ecosystem. And I think that like Web3 isn't just going to be on one chain. I think that like Web3 is, associated with a blockchain, but it is going to be like a culture of its own. And so if I, am going to walk the walk in terms of internationalization, globalization, diversity, like I have to do the same. And I think the thing is that you say that like, oh, like we're building for ourselves. The problem is that like your friends aren't paying for your projects or products, right? And like, that's not really a secret. That's true. And so I think the thing is that the reality in the bear is that like we need to kind of go outside of our circle, which is like business 101, and like show our product to our mom and say like, do you understand this? Because if we want like our parents to be the future users of this ecosystem, we have to start engaging with regular folks. And I'm like air quoting regular folks here.
Yeah, the normies of the world. I honestly think that building an onboarding product is like the easiest thing in some ways because your user testing is there. Like you were saying, you can literally go to your mom, your dad, or your brother, your sister, like anybody in your family, and ask them to test out your product. And that is like the perfect user testing. That's your ideal kind of customer. But anyway, I want to move into some questions that we have from our community. But before we do that, do you have any final thoughts on kind of this global internet culture or just building a global Web3 workforce or anything that we haven't talked about yet that you want to make sure listeners have a chance to hear?
Yeah. I think the thing is that like, if you want to build a global audience or a global workforce, you have to engage with people in those regions that you'd like to, build for. I think that what we're mistaking kind of globalization is really like American culture, which has become global. But if we're really trying to attract different regions, then you need to go on the ground or you need to talk to people in those regions and provide an opportunity for people that know their culture and know their city or know wherever they're trying to attract or where you're trying to attract in terms of like internationalization best. So I don't know, talk to people outside of your circle, think outside of the box, and like, don't be afraid to be curious and search the internet for the answers.
Search the internet. All the answers are there. All right. Oh, I want to move into some questions we have from Twitter. The first one is from Ninty Nick, and he asked, "What's the future of the governance facilitator role? How does the evolved form of the role/function interact with directing the DAO's attention, for example, via proposal curation?"
Okay. So I think that in order to attract the DAO's attention, and I think what he means by DAO's attention is maybe like DAO members, is that people are always going to be interested in whatever they're interested in. If you are a good facilitator, I think you're basically just facilitating the conversation and ensuring that there's engagement within the conversation. I think what's missing in terms of like DAO, engagement or diversification of engagement in terms of governance is really that we just need to get like communication channels on board. So if there are like proposals that are happening, provide a myriad opportunity for people to know particular proposals are happening. So like not just like one community call, like letting people know on Twitter and letting people know like within your groups or things like that. I think that because we're still in a decentralized fashion, until DAOs kind of create their own community identity and maybe like rules in which to play with one another in that area, facilitation is just going to be really different depending on your community. So I don't really have the answer for that particularly, but I would always just start with some solid documentation and understanding the user's journey when it comes to the governance process, and then just going from there.
When you think about a governance facilitator, are we basically talking about a community builder or a community manager?
No, what I'm thinking about a governance, like, I guess what I think about a governance facilitator is twofold, right? So it's either like the operator that is like managing the governance process, like the person may be responsible for the documentation and the forums or things like that. Or a governance facilitator could also be somebody people ask questions to about the process. And so I think that that's what I think more of as a governance facilitator. It works differently in different DAOs, but in a generic sense, just for the sake of this conversation, that's kind of where my answer was based on.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification there. Ninty Nick has another question. What are your thoughts on expertise-based delegation? And if your thoughts are that it's good, how can we empower more of it?
This is somebody from HATS protocol.
Yeah.
So I totally
He's been on the
I
podcast.
totally understand it. Okay. So I think that there should be tiered governance. And when I say tiered governance, an example could be, is that, a types of proposals specifically for whales, a type of proposal specifically for contributors, and a type of proposals specifically for everybody. I think that like when we mish everything together, like you're never going to find unison in regards to that. And I think that it would be naive for us to assume that all these different people, maybe who bought in or who contributed or who have just become members will feel the same way about having the same say is quite naive. In terms of expertise, I think the thing is that like expertise is subjective. And until we have created specific like frameworks, like in terms of like documentation of like what that expertise means and how valuable it could be within the community, I don't think it will matter in the state of delegation as it is right now. Like I think that there are a lot of subjective, decisions made on why people delegate to who. Like maybe they're on the page and people are like, hey, I want to delegate to them. I think the thing about delegation is that like, how do we make people more intentional about who they're delegating to? But then also it's like, what information can we provide them in order for them to make that intentional decision? So that's my answer.
Love it. I love it. And then last question from the community. This one comes from Infinite Homie on Twitter. I know Feems has great insight on governance and Web3 compensation. I'd like to know what she sees in the future for Web3 and DAOs.
Ooh.
It's a pretty big question.
I can't see what's in the future, but I think that from my experience, what's most successful is that trust is really reliant on people that you know, and that are within your circle. And so I think that if like, I don't know if the like large scale DAOs are going to work as well. I think that like what's really going to happen, or what I see really happening, is that like people in smaller groups are going to create their own little organizations that have aligned values with each other, and they can develop relationships with each other in order to achieve whatever they want to achieve collaboratively. I hope that we now go towards a human-centric approach to community collaboration. And I hope that we don't rely on naming things. Like I never want to just be known as the person who is a member of or contributor of this. And I've been seeing a lot of people associate themselves with the brand of their DAO. But then like what happens if you get get let go of the DAO, or if the DAO is no longer there, like what happens to your identity? And so I think the thing is that, you know, what I love about the internet is like the freedom to play in any way that I want to. What I love about Web3 is that it provides me an opportunity to be sovereign as to like where I want to play and like the projects that I want to be in. And like, that's not a luxury. I worked hard for that because it's based on experience and expertise, but we do have the sovereignty within as individuals, not thinking as this as the, like, this is how it's going to pay my bills, but thinking of this as like, this is a new experience for me. And I want to see whether or not I can explore all the different facets within this ecosystem. And like, maybe one of them can bring me joy. So like, I just hope, like, it doesn't matter what the future of Web3 or DAOs will be. Like, I just hope that more people can kind of see and create spaces for themselves within the future of the internet.
Yeah, and I think we'll definitely start to see that. I think right now it's kind of like this Web3 is its own community because we're so early and we're so small. But I think as Web3 becomes more, it you know, reaches more of the mainstream, I think we'll start to see subcultures develop just like we did with the original internet. You know, like the early days of the internet, we were all on the same forums and all on the same message boards. And then over time, we have like the music forums, we have like the, you know, different, the anime forums and like the different kinds of subcultures that developed within that. I think we'll start to see that with Web3 too.
Yeah. And just to add though, is that I know that everybody says like, you don't have to be technical to get into this space. You don't. But it's really important, and I'm starting to learn this more now, is that like understanding decentralized finance is going to be key. So in any way that you can, I mean, not saying invest in anything, but like really understanding DeFi is going to provide you an much more opportunities. Cause like right now it'll be like, it's less diverse because, you know, not many people are told that it's really important to know it because then it can like maybe help you later on.
Yeah, that's a really good perspective. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So at the end of every episode, we end with a quick little game. It's called the word association game. So I've got this tin of about 50 slips of paper in here, and I'm going to draw 10 of these at random. These are all words that are commonly misused or overused in Web3. So these are all words that I'm sure you've heard of and that you've seen a lot of on crypto Twitter if you spend any time there at all. I'm just going to draw 10 at random. I'm going to read the word, and you are going to say the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word. Okay? And it's just meant to be really quick, rapid fire. Don't think about it too much or at all. And we'll blow through this really quickly. Make sense?
So I'm supposed to just say a word. You say a word and I say a word that comes to mind.
I'm going to say, yeah. So like if I said dog, you would say the first thing that comes to mind. Okay. Yeah, exactly. You got it.
Okay.
You got it. I like that practice round. Okay. First one, creator.
Innovator.
Meta governance.
Chaotic.
Scalable.
Scalable. Sustainable.
Ecosystem.
Culture.
Okay. Walled garden.
Floral.
Community.
Human.
Interoperable.
Penetration.
Web3.
New.
Ownership.
Sovereignty.
Okay. And last one, privacy.
Security.
Nice. Good job.
Yeah.
You blew through that.
I was actually kind of confused what walled.
Huh?
I was actually just kind of confused what walled garden was, and so I was just like, garden, flowers.
I feel like it's just like one of those buzzwords that somehow people in the space have caught on to. Like, I feel like concentric circles is like another one that like everything is like a concentric circle, or like everything nowadays is like modular, which I mean, modular I think has more meaning in a technical sense, but you know,
Yeah,
one of those.
for sure.
Feems, thank you so much for taking the time. Last thing before you go, let us know where we can find you on the internet And also, I know you're working on some big things that you're planning on launching this summer.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you're able to share any of that, but we would love to hear if you're able to share about anything that you're planning for launch this summer. Go ahead and plug away.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter at Feems Chats. So that's FEEMSCHATS. And I am also building Work on Chain, which is going to be an array of creative projects and products that will help onboard freelancers and also those working in Web3 make sense of working in Web3. So think of it as your, I don't know, internet career center, if you will.
Love it. And when can we expect to see that?
So it's live. So we have it so Twitter's live. It's on Work on Chain. And then we'll be re-releasing the podcast, which is called Web3 Pro. So Web3 Professionals. And a caveat is that why we're re-releasing it is that there were too many white dudes on the roster. And I want to have diverse voices of what's happening in Web3 by really talented individuals that just so happen to be not white guys.
No, trust me. If I completely understand where you're coming from, as all of our community members know, diversity is one of our core values, and they've really come through. And the guests that they've nominated and voted on for the past seasons, we've had more than 50% female guests on every season of the podcast, which for a Web3 podcast is pretty insane numbers, considering we can hardly find women in the space. So I absolutely support that and understand that 100%. So yeah, people go follow Feems so you can keep up to date with everything she's working on. Go follow Work on Chain on Twitter. Listen to her podcast, Web3 Professionals. And this is our last episode of season 4. So make sure you collect this episode on Manifold. You can find the link in our Twitter bio at Rehash Web3. You can support Feems that way as well. And then you can also get your governance rights in Rehash so that you can help us nominate and vote for which guests get to come on season 5 of the podcast, which will be the voting process for that will be starting next week. So thank you, listeners, for tuning in to this episode and to all of season 4. And we will be back again in about a month or so with a new season of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and sponsored by Lens, Empire Wallet, and NFT.storage. Rehash is also supported by Rehash DAO, a community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes a part of Rehash DAO and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. Voting rights are reserved for our guests, sponsors, and OG crowdfund supporters. And to learn more about how to become a guest or sponsor, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at RehashWeb3, or on Lens at rehash.lens.